Is this why almost 800 buildings have collapsed? Is there something wrong with the materials they used? And more aftershocks are happening, and the residents are angry that not enough help is coming. A lot is going on. The 72-hour window is closing. That would give rescuers still time to find people alive. A lot is happening. Let's dive into this. What are the latest facts? First, before we go into that construction issue, I was reporting about this a little bit in my last video, but I mean, it is kind of strange, and you have to say that all these towers and buildings were collapsing in kind of the same way. Is this only geology? Is this special ground there why this is happening? Or is this corners cut? Latest numbers we're getting, people lost 1,430 to 1,450 confirmed in the latest major reports. But, you know, the thing is, now they say injured 3,150 and to 3,238. But the thing is, the number of missing and unaccounted people right now, more than 68,000 people still missing. So this is the problem. Some news stations say 50,000, some they say 55,000. What we can definitely be sure, tens of thousands of people are still missing or unaccounted for. Buildings collapsed. We're nearing almost 800 buildings that have collapsed. And if you see the aerial videos behind me, the ones that are still standing, some of them, many of them, barely holding on. They look like, really, the images that we see from Ukraine when missiles hit the buildings, this looks equally as bad. So it really looks like a war zone. So a lot of buildings are severely damaged that might collapse on their own. And some videos that I see where these brave men, the rescuers, are going in and the tower next to them is leaning or so severely collapsed, they're risking their lives as well because they could be hit by another falling tower. Hardest hit area, La Guaira State, around 40 kilometers, that's 25 miles north of Caracas. That's the worst hit area. We see a lot of towers with swimming pools along the coastline. Dozens of buildings, hundreds of buildings collapsed into rubble there, and displaced people so far only in that area of almost 13,000 people. At least 33 people were rescued alive over the weekend, including children. But guys, I mean, if you look at the number of missing people on the one side and on that tiny number of people that is actually being rescued, it worries us. It's frightening, it's terrifying, because the 72-hour rescue window that is critical has now passed. And because what the experts are telling us, the first 72 hours are considered the most crucial for finding survivors. A Swiss rescue leader says survival probability drops sharply after roughly 3 days, and we're at 4 days. That's the territory that we're in. International rescue effort, 24 countries have provided support, including almost 600 tons of supplies. 86 canine teams are searching, and more than 2,741 search and rescue team and support personnel backing the around 30,000 Venezuelan specialists. The estimated direct damage, 6.7 billion, is the estimate. And then the aftershock. Moderate earthquake near Caracas, of course, was hindering rescue efforts. So while international aid has begun arriving in Venezuela, the rescue efforts were disrupted again by a moderate, we have to say, earthquake of magnitude 4.7 that struck west of Caracas in the evening yesterday. Of course, the earthquake was not strong enough to cause serious damage to undamaged buildings. which there are not many, the resulting ground movement may have further compacted debris from already collapsed structures, potentially endangering survivors that are still trapped in there, right? If you shake something, it's compacting and it's getting flatter. This is the problem with these aftershocks. The aftershock, that earthquake, occurred along a fault zone that is parallel or running parallel to the coast of Venezuela. It's basically part of the same fault bundle that has triggered the first two strong quakes, 7.2 and 7.5, within 39 seconds. So this unfortunately tells us that further crustal segments within that transformed shear zone are under stress, and there may be sufficient stress potential to trigger further strong earthquakes. We could see aftershocks, hopefully only aftershocks. They could be in the higher magnitudes. So another earthquake of roughly the same magnitude occurred further north in the Caribbean, specifically east of the volcanic island arc of the Lesser Antilles. So that is home to well-known volcanoes, so as Montagne Pelée and Soufriere Hills, which has done devastating events, burying a whole town. So these Caribbean volcanoes are all within the area of the influence of Thursday's two strong earthquakes, and could still show signs of activity in the coming days or weeks. But now let's get to what I mentioned earlier. I'll show you the video that rescuers filmed, and then they're touching the rubble of these collapsed buildings. And they're touching the concrete blocks, and it looks like styrofoam or something like this, really porous. And of course, if that is the load bearing, if that was constructed as a load bearing column, you would not be surprised that these buildings were falling like this. But is this really the case? Rescuers were acting really surprised when they saw that. But there's a discussion going on about this right now. And I want to make that clear. While that discussion and the rescue efforts are going on, smaller tremors and aftershocks, almost probably 150 smaller tremors, are rattling the area constantly. That 4.7 was just the one that was in the higher range. That's why the authorities urge the population to remain alert, avoid entering structures with damage, and follow the recommendation of emergency agencies. Because if you go in one of these half-fallen towers, they can collapse with the next tremor. They're on the brink, and many buildings, they look really, really shocking, absolutely shocking. To put this in perspective, the most largest magnitudes, the earthquakes with the highest magnitudes in the history of Venezuela, in 1900, number 1, 7.7, but number 2 is already this earthquake right now with 7.5. Number 3 was in 2018, a 7.3. And number 4 is again this earthquake sequence with a 7.2. And then in 1997, we had a 7.0. That just to put it a little bit into perspective. So let's talk about the debris. And let's talk about what they're finding. So some say this could be the reason why the towers are all falling in the same way. Did they cut corners? Many are built by the same project, by the same contractor. Many contractors are from out of country. We've heard that. Some from Russia, some from China. We cannot identify which tower right now that fell was built by whom, but definitely destruction in some development projects where we do know that, and that might have received criticism. As an example, the Hugo Chavez housing complex, you see the image here where one is still standing, and then you see the rubble in front of it, but all these images here are from that complex. 7,000 people reside there. It's reported that the vast majority of the structures collapsed. So you have to imagine, of the 193 buildings, only 3 remained standing, according to reports. So Experts are now pointing out that among the possible causes of the disaster would be the low quality of the materials, the lack of supervision when they were built, and the absence of anti-seismic construction rules. I mean, 193 buildings, only 3 standing. That is bad, to say the least. So we do have complaints and images emerging that the columns of the buildings that were built only in 2011, I mean, they should have learned from the 1967 earthquake that gave a similar picture. And they did say that they would revise codes and build to better standards. So Hugo Chavez development area 2011. So they say they would have used light materials such as expanded polystyrene, EPS called, or anime, in parts of their construction. So the initial purpose of that housing development was to relocate thousands of people affected by the heavy rains of 2010 and to give access to homes for low-income families. So, of course, they were not luxury apartments. Of course, if you see the images of the rubble here, it really looks like, I mean, you wouldn't even build a sandcastle with that. That would not hold up. But then there's other people that say information needs to be corroborated. That material, EPS, is used in construction, but not on columns. And they're giving example images. So yeah, it's the question, where was it used? Other people say, no, the load-bearing columns of a building should never be filled with expanded polystyrene, like anime. If a column that supports the weight of a building were filled with anime, the structure would collapse immediately. Anime has no structural strength. So his estimate is what you're probably seeing in the video, or what is causing the confusion, is due to these real construction methods. So lost formwork. Sometimes anime is used as an internal mold to shape certain decorative concrete elements or hollow beams, but the weight is supported by steel and concrete on the outside. Expansion joints between 2 adjacent buildings or structures, an anime sheet is usually placed. So this serves to prevent the 2 buildings from colliding and destroying each other when it shakes or the concrete expands due to heat. The weight is supported by the beams, not the anime. So what you're seeing in the video is not a load-bearing column. So I hope that this is the case. It makes sense, right? So they're saying it's not a load-bearing column. What you see is not a column, it's an expansion joint or construction joint. So in the images you can see a collapsed structure, probably from the recent earthquake, yes. So what the man in the video is hitting and breaking with his hand is a large vertical sheet of anime expanded polystyrene. So this is not the interior of a column. In civil engineering, when large buildings are constructed or 2 structures are attached, a space for a few inches or centimeters is left between them so that each one moves independently when it shakes or when the concrete expands due to heat. To fill that gap while building and to prevent fresh cement from moving, anime is used. This is called lost formwork or expansion joint. When the building collapses, that joint is exposed, making it seem to the untrained eye that the column was made of anime. So let's hope and pray that they didn't cut corners, that everything, I mean, this will take months and weeks to find out when they go through the rubble. What people are also say, it's obvious at first glance that there is no structural steel there. The load-bearing columns of any government or private building have a dense cage of steel rebars. Yeah, concrete reinforced steel and high-strength concrete inside. So in the video, it's clearly seen that the anime is stuck to a wall or a flat element without the steel that would necessarily require be required for a real column. If that piece were the support of the building, it wouldn't have lasted even a single day after its construction, much less years. So makes sense, right? Makes absolute sense. But let's put this in a geological perspective. This is very important. And these are what the lessons some nations learn and some others forget, because these earthquakes that struck Venezuela is not the only country that has earthquakes problems like that. Japan sits on one of the most active plate boundaries on Earth and is shaken by earthquakes like that, or even larger, like megathrust earthquakes, subduction earthquakes, magnitude 9 plus, and just had another one, right? So large earthquakes quite frequently. But usually when it comes to the earthquakes, Japan gets through them with a small fraction of people lost. So not with devastating numbers like they are unfortunately unfolding here in Venezuela. So people, of course, have been asking why. I mean, Japan is probably the best prepared country in the world when it comes to earthquakes, so we kind of understand why. But also part of the answer is geological. Let's begin with the ground, because the ground is more important than you might think, or than people, they just compare, oh, Japan, the energy of an earthquake travels outwards as seismic waves, and what those waves do when they arrive depends heavily on what they arrive in. I mean, we all know that we say, oh yeah, liquefaction and stuff like this. Yes, exactly. If we are dealing with hard bedrock, it carries the shaking through like quickly and lets it pass. But if we have soft sediment, we have an old river fill, an old lake bed, stuff that gathers in basins and valleys over time, that stuff does the opposite. I've reported about LA that is like a basin that has this problem recently. So soft sediment, the old lake bed, the river fill, it traps the waves. It slows them down and then it amplifies them, sometimes several times over. So a magnitude 7.5 is already bad enough, but that amplified several times over is bad. And another thing, it makes the shaking last longer, far longer. And here's the point. Parts of Caracas sits on exactly this kind of soft basin fill. And the buildings that they built on it that fell, they basically got the worst of it, right? There were some buildings on a different ground, on firmer ground, that did not collapse. So we have to look at a very, very rough example that demonstrates this. Many say no other place on earth, Mexico City. Mexico City is built on the drained bed of Lake Texcoco. Did you know that? That's a basin. It's a basin of soft clay, so waterlogged, really, really waterlogged, so that in 1985, when there was a magnitude 8 earthquake that struck the Pacific coast, and I mean Pacific coast, more than like 280 miles away, 250 kilometers from Mexico City, did something to Mexico City. The waves of this earthquake reached the old lake bed and the ground began to, we have to say, like a struck drum, resonate. So the soft clay was shaking back and forth for a very long time, for minutes, at a frequency that matched the natural sway of mid-rise buildings. So, and around 400 of them collapsed. 400 buildings collapsed. Tens of thousands of people were lost, while the coast, and that's the interesting part, the coast that was actually closer to the earthquake epicenter survived that comparatively with lighter damage. So the distant Mexico City suffered more than the near ones, simply because of the ground it was built on. Mexico took that lesson. They did, and they rebuilt their own earthquake codes around that, factoring in the ground. They installed actually the first public earthquake early warning system in the Americas. And then after that they had a magnitude 7.1 earthquake happening underneath Mexico City in 2017, far fewer buildings collapsed. But the ground had not changed, right? But what they did to the buildings had changed. The response that they had changed. Japan, it's a developing thing, right? Japan has learned the same lesson a century earlier and has adapted, never forgot that lessons. After the great Kanto earthquake in 1923 that ended more than 100,000 people, the country brought in one of the world's first national seismic building codes the following year. And then they kept rewriting that code after every major earthquake. They studied how each building had failed, and then they tried closing the gap that actually ended the people. A landmark revision in 1981 proved its worth in the Kobe earthquake in 1995, where structures that were built after 1981 mostly stood, while the older ones came down around the newer ones. So the whole society now rests on a permanent assumption that the earthquakes will return, and they will, and that assumption is the real defense. The steel and concrete, basically how we can say, are the only form it takes. And I said it in my last video, I was giving you more details about this. Venezuela had the same possibility to learn from past catastrophes, but they did not hold on to it, or they did something wrong. The country has been shaken hard before. We had a strong earthquake in 1812 that has destroyed Caracas and killed thousands at a moment so charged that it nearly broke the independence movement that was going on. But in 1967, another one struck Caracas directly, and it has collapsed. Modern apartment blocks in almost the same way has demonstrated exactly how this soil, this sediment underneath Caracas basically makes that shaking worse. So the knowledge was there. They knew it. And the 1967 disaster even produced new design rules. But a code written after one catastrophe only saves the lives if it's enforced through the long, quiet decades that follow. And that is what many question right now, that it has not been. I have made a video about this. It's titled They Knew, where I explain that a little bit more. Of course, Venezuela is a country that has spent almost 20 years in economic collapse and hyperinflation. So would you spend, if you are a developer and you want to build some housing, would you spend a lot of money for expensive codes and nobody buys your unit? Or, you know what I mean? It's dangerous, right? So if the country is in such a state, enforcement, retrofitting, that was never on the first item on their list. So much of the buildings that fell or will fall in this earthquake on June 24th, they were old, unreinforced concrete buildings from the oil boom years, it seems, never reinforced or strengthened since. So worst of it, we've seen it in La Guaira, coastal state, basically below Caracas, where whole buildings pancaked. This is the name for that. So they have to work with shovels because no machinery arrived at first. But also, we can compare this with the Philippines, sits between the two, basically. And maybe the most instructive case of all, it knows the danger. Absolutely, it lies on the Pacific Ring of Fire, basically crossed by these subduction zones and active fault lines, and has seen towers collapse. 1968, the Ruby Tower collapse, the Luzon earthquake of 1990 that has ended more than 1,600 people. And then we had just now 7.8 Mindanao, June 8 this year, only a few days before what now happened in Venezuela. And they do have a national building code, and we saw concrete buildings sway and nothing happened. The building code is existent with genuine seismic provisions, but they also struggle with enforcement. They're dealing with substandard materials, plans altered without approval to cut corners, leave out material and reinforce. You know, to reinforce buildings and structures, you need steel. That's expensive, right? So leave it out. Construction left unsupervised. No structural engineer controlled whether the reinforcing steel beams were actually installed. Houses were built on unstable ground. So after the quake that just happened, investigators found that 30% of villages in General Santos City sit on unstable ground, and engineers again pleaded for the code to be applied rather than merely written. And geologists are telling the authorities this will not be the last time. There will be more large earthquakes in the coming years, and the preparation has to be continuous because the threat never stops. So also in the Mindanao earthquake, we had buildings collapse, don't get me wrong, right? Earthquakes do not give a warning. And especially in areas that do not see an earthquake once a year or several times a year, people tend to forget. If there's longer stretches, everything is the danger feels abstract, money's needed elsewhere. And I can say the West Coast that sits on the Cascadia Fault that will experience a magnitude 9+, Canada, Vancouver, there are so many buildings that will collapse, high multi-story towers from the 60s, concrete towers. Victoria, the capital of British Columbia, it's going to be bad. Old masonry buildings, unreinforced. Same in the US, Portland especially. But, you know, so Cascadia Fault ruptures every 300 to 500 years. So people forget because nothing bad has ever happened. Nothing has collapsed so that they could reinforce their building codes and learn from that. You would have to look to other countries and learn from that, right? Maybe you should. But when I see how they built here, forget about it. I have to say that. Really, I have to say. The lesson. It's a hard one to hold on to. Japan held on to it for 100 years. Mexico learned it in a single terrible earthquake in 1985 and they acted. The Philippines, they know it and they're still struggling to turn basically that knowing into enforcing. Venezuela knew it once, wrote it down, and then let it slip beneath the weight of another crisis, right? The faults will never stop moving. But what changes the outcome is what is happening in the quiet years in between. Will they react? Will they enforce codes? How will they build? People need to believe that the ground will move again and act accordingly, build accordingly. So guys, this is my takeaway. If you want to know what's going on at Mount Etna, a mysterious crack opened and it's already seen that this is displacing downwards, vertical displacement, gravity. There's a flank collapse in the work at the dangerous Mount Etna volcano. Check it out. I see you here in a second. Bye-bye.